Have you ever seen a child's portrait that made you feel uneasy? Not because of what it showed, but because of what it seemed to hide. In 1903, a wealthy Massachusetts family posed for what should have been an ordinary photograph, a symbol of comfort, success, and respectability. Yet in the image, the youngest son, 7-year-old Benjamin Blackwood, gazed into the camera with an expression far too cold, far too knowing for a child. It was a look that historians would later struggle to explain. Decades after that photograph was taken, a quiet researcher named Harrison uncovered something buried in factory archives, inspection records, and family letters, a trail leading from the shining mills of New England to the dark corners of a child's mind. Tonight we'll follow that trail together. We'll uncover what Benjamin saw inside his father's textile mills and how those sights shaped the man he would become. But before we reach the end, I'll ask you to look once more at that portrait and decide for yourself what exactly does a child learn when surrounded by suffering he's taught to ignore. In the quiet winter of 2024, antique photograph appraiser David Harrison received a call unlike any other he'd had in his 25 years of work. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Warren of the Berkshire County Historical Society in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a place known for its stately old buildings and carefully guarded archives. Her tone was calm, but something in it carried unease. "We've acquired a collection from the estate of a prominent family," she explained, "and one particular photograph has been troubling our staff." Harrison paused. He'd handled countless vintage images, daguerreotypes, albumen, prints, tintypes, but rarely did experienced archivists use the word troubling. Dr. Warren continued softly. "It's a 1903 family portrait. At first glance, perfectly ordinary. But there's something about one of the children that feels deeply wrong." That was enough to stir Harrison's curiosity. In his long career, he had learned that when an old photograph unsettled people, it was seldom by accident. There was always something, a detail that defied logic, a presence that did not belong, or a shadow that refused to behave. The Berkshire County Historical Society occupied a dignified brick building on South Street, its rooms cool and silent, like a museum of memory. Dr. Warren met Harrison in the climate-controlled research facility, where the Blackwood family collection, dozens of photographs, letters, and personal effects was being carefully processed. "This is the one," she said, placing a thick-mounted 8x1 portrait onto the examination table. "It shows the Blackwood family of Lee, Massachusetts. Taken at a professional studio in Springfield in the autumn of 1903. Harrison leaned closer. At first, it seemed harmless, a prosperous family in their best attire, posed with care before a painted backdrop. He had seen thousands like it. Fathers standing tall, mothers seated gracefully, children arranged neatly between, the mounting the paper, the ink all period appropriate, the photographer's technique impeccable. It was by all measures a fine example of early 20th century portraiture. And yet, there it was, the faint but undeniable sensation that something in this frozen scene refused to rest quietly in its frame. The Blackwoods were captured in the height of their respectability. William Blackwood, about 40, stood behind his seated wife, an imposing man in a dark suit with a silk vest and gold watch chain. his stern expression projecting the authority expected of a successful industrialist. Beside him sat Eleanor Blackwood, poised in an ornate velvet chair, her dress adorned with delicate beadwork and lace that whispered of immense wealth. Her hair was arranged in the fashionable pompadour of 1903, and the jewelry she wore caught the studio light in subtle glints of gold. Their 2 children completed the composition. 12-year-old Charlotte stood close to her mother, wearing a sailor-collared dress, a popular style among the privileged daughters of that era. At her father's feet sat 7-year-old Benjamin, a small figure in a finely tailored suit with knee breeches and high stockings. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. Behind them, the painted studio backdrop depicted marble columns and a lush garden, a timeless illusion of refinement, favored by Springfield's best photographers. The lighting was flawless, the exposure perfect. Every surface, every fold, every expression frozen in careful harmony. Everything was, by all accounts, right. And yet, as Harrison studied the photograph under the white glare of the research lamp, the air around the table seemed to grow strangely still. Something subtle but undeniable felt off. Something within that image didn't quite belong. What could it be? A trick of the light? A flaw in the plate? Or perhaps something far older and far less willing to be explained? Harrison began his careful examination of the portrait, tracing every detail through his magnifying lens. The family's positioning, the folds of fabric, even the polished glint of the father's watch chain, all followed the formal conventions of early 20th century portraiture. Everything seemed proper, deliberate, until his lens came to rest upon the face of the younger child, 7-year-old Benjamin Blackwood. And in that instant, Harrison understood why the staff at the Historical Society had felt so deeply unsettled. Through the lens, Benjamin's features sharpened into clarity, and with them a feeling that the photograph was watching him back. There was something profoundly wrong about the boy's expression. His eyes, dark and unblinking, carried a weight that simply didn't belong to a child. They held none of the playfulness, curiosity, or shy discomfort that one expects from children in portraits of that era. Instead, they projected something cold, deliberate, aware. Harrison studied the face more closely, feeling a slow unease building in his chest. Benjamin's gaze seemed calculating, intelligent, in a way that felt alien, even adult. It wasn't the seriousness of a child being told to hold still for a photograph. It was the gaze of someone who understood far too much, someone measuring the world and the people in it. There was no trace of innocence in that expression. No wonder, no mischief, only composure and quiet control. The face of a boy who seemed to have seen too much or done too much for his 7 short years. Dr. Warren joined him at the table, her voice hushed. "Look at his posture," she said softly. Compared to his sister, Harrison did. Charlotte, standing beside their mother, displayed the familiar tension of a child, trying her best to appear proper. Her eyes held that nervous spark of life, her smile faintly forced her small movements, betraying the impatience of youth. But Benjamin sat perfectly still. His small hands rested in precise alignment, his expression untouched by the strain of the long exposure. "He seems too comfortable," Dr. Warren murmured, as if this wasn't the first time he'd posed like this. Harrison nodded slowly. The difference between the siblings was striking, almost unnatural. Charlotte's nervous humanity only made Benjamin's composure more chilling. His poise was absolute, too complete. It suggested either an upbringing that demanded unnatural restraint or experiences that had stripped childhood away before it had even begun. And then there was the boy's gaze. It wasn't directed at the camera at all. Instead, his eyes seemed fixed slightly to one side, focused on something or someone beyond the edge of the frame. The look was calculating, observant, almost supervisory. It gave the eerie impression that the 7-year-old wasn't being photographed at all. He was overseeing the portrait as though he, not the photographer, were in control of the room. Harrison leaned back, uneasy. To understand this photograph, he realized, meant understanding him and the strange circumstances that had shaped the Blackwood family in 1903. He began with the Historical Society's acquisition files, tracing how the photograph had come to them. The collection, it turned out, had been donated by Margaret Blackwood Stevens, great-granddaughter of William and Eleanor Blackwood. In her donor statement, Margaret explained that she had discovered the photographs while clearing out the attic of the family's old estate in Lee, Massachusetts. The boxes had sat untouched for decades, sealed away after her grandmother's death. Her letter accompanying the donation mentioned something curious, that the Blackwoods had always been strangely private about their early history in Western Massachusetts, particularly about events from the early 1900s. Her grandmother, she wrote, seldom spoke of her childhood, and when old family photographs were brought out, she would grow quiet, sometimes even leave the room. Harrison contacted Margaret to ask about the portrait. She was polite but cautious. When he mentioned Benjamin's name, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said quietly, "My grandmother. The girl in that photo used to say something terrible happened to her brother when they were children." Her voice trembled slightly. She never said what, only that he was changed. That after it happened, he wasn't the same anymore. Harrison listened carefully as Margaret continued, hesitating between sentences as if deciding how much to tell. After 1903, she said the adults in the family started treating Benjamin differently. My grandmother said they were afraid of him, that he somehow knew things a child shouldn't know, and that his behavior became increasingly strange as he grew older. Her words lingered long after the call ended. A family frightened of their own child. A boy who looked at the world as though he'd already seen its worst truths. And a photograph, silent, unmoving, that seemed to capture the moment. Something in him had changed forever. Harrison realized the portrait was more than an artifact. It was a fragment of something larger, something hidden beneath generations of silence. To uncover it, he would have to dive into records far older than the photograph itself. He began his research with the obvious, the Blackwoods' business dealings in 1903. Public archives revealed their wealth came from the textile industry that had once powered Western Massachusetts. But within the records, he found troubling notes, reports of labor disputes, violations, and exploitative practices. At the Lee Historical Society, employment rosters from that year showed that William Blackwood owned multiple textile mills, employing hundreds of workers, many of them recent immigrants, some heartbreakingly with children. And as Harrison read those names, The cold gaze from that 1903 photograph seemed to follow him as though Benjamin Blackwood, across the distance of a century, still knew exactly what he was searching for. The Springfield Republican Archives from 1903 offered Harrison his next clue. Among the crumbling pages, he found a series of articles chronicling the labor conditions within Western Massachusetts' booming textile industry. The headlines were polite, but grim, quiet accounts of injury, exhaustion, and loss. Beneath them, the words described children laboring beside adults in mills thick with dust and the ceaseless hum of machinery. Though William Blackwood's name was never mentioned directly, the reports painted a picture of an entire industry built upon the backs of the poor and the very young. The further Harrison read, the heavier the air around him seemed to grow. But the real revelation came not from the newspapers but from the state's own inspection files. The Massachusetts Department of Factory Inspection had, in 1903, opened a formal inquiry into several of the region's largest textile operations, among them the Blackwood Mills. The inspector's notes were clinical, factual, and horrifying. They described machinery that mangled limbs, workdays that stretched long into the night, and children, some as young as 8, assigned to tasks that would have tested the strength and precision of grown men. The records confirmed that William Blackwood's factories had been under scrutiny for repeated violations of child labor laws and for exposing workers to dangerous chemicals and unguarded machines. But one detail, buried within the inspector's testimonies, froze Harrison's hand as he turned the brittle pages. Several witnesses, it said, had reported seeing William Blackwood's own children inside the mills. He had brought them there himself, for educational purposes, he claimed. And among those witnesses, one name appeared again and again: Benjamin. A boy of 7, pale and quiet, often seen standing beside his father as the great machines thundered on around them. Harrison leaned back in his chair. Suddenly, Benjamin's expression in that 1903 portrait made terrible sense. He hadn't been a child posing stiffly for a photograph. He had been learning, absorbing a world far darker than anyone should at that age. Through the lens of that camera, perhaps he already understood what most adults refuse to admit: that the family's wealth, the velvet chairs, the gold watch chains, the elegance immortalized in that portrait, had been built upon the suffering of children not so different from himself. The deeper Harrison delved into the records, the more chilling the story became. The factory inspection files detailed conditions more severe than any standard violation. Inspectors had documented cases of children barely 6 years old operating intricate textile machinery without safety guards or training. Accidents were common. Some resulted in disfigurement, others in quiet deaths that never reached the papers. The victims were almost always the children of recent immigrants' families, desperate for work, often unable to read the contracts they signed. The reports described fathers and mothers who endured exhaustion and fear, who risked everything just to feed their families, only to find their children trapped in the same cycle. And William Blackwood, the inspectors wrote, had devised his own cruel system to maintain control. Workers who hesitated to send their children back into the mills were fined, threatened, or evicted from company housing. Entire families could lose everything in a single day if they defied his orders. Then came the most disturbing entry of all. Witnesses recalled that Benjamin had been present during several of the worst injuries that left children maimed or permanently scarred. In one particularly haunting account, a 9-year-old boy lost several fingers to a machine. When it happened, William Blackwood reportedly did not rush to help. Instead, he calculated the cost of the lost labor, and beside him, little Benjamin stood silently watching, not crying, not frightened, but observing, his eyes fixed on his father's calm, businesslike reaction. One worker described it this way: the boy watched as if he were learning something, not about pain, but about control. Harrison felt an almost physical chill run through him. Benjamin had not inherited his father's empire yet, but he had already inherited his gaze. The same cold detachment that the photograph captured so perfectly. The portrait, Harrison realized, wasn't just a family record. It was evidence of something quietly passed down, a knowledge that should never have belonged to a child. And as he sat in the dim reading room, the echo of those old machines seemed to hum faintly in the silence. What else, he wondered, had Benjamin seen in those mills? And what had he become after that photograph was taken? The state's factory investigation into the Blackwood textile mills, like so many inquiries of that era, never reached the courts. It was quietly resolved through influence, reputation, and money. Political connections ensured that William Blackwood faced no prosecution. Settlements were arranged. Files were closed. And just like that, the lives of those injured children, their pain, their silence were swept neatly out of sight. But for 7-year-old Benjamin, those months had been an education of another kind. He had watched his father manipulate. The system had seen how power could bend truth, how wealth could purchase forgiveness. And in that twisted lesson, he had discovered something terrible, that consequences could be erased if one only held enough control. The Massachusetts inspection files that Harrison examined contained witness statements more chilling than any legal record. Several workers, ordinary men and women whose names had long been forgotten, had spoken of the Blackwood boy, the small, quiet child who had stood among the machines, with eyes that never blinked. One of them, Maria Santos, recalled an accident she would never forget. A 10-year-old girl had been burned when a vat of chemical dye spilled across her arms. The other workers had screamed for help, for water, for mercy. But Benjamin had simply watched. Maria described his expression as the cold interest of someone studying an insect. Later, she testified, the boy had asked his father why the injured children weren't sent to doctors. William Blackwood, she said, told him calmly that medical treatment would be too costly and might encourage others to feign injury. Benjamin, according to Maria, had nodded in quiet satisfaction as if he understood. Another witness, Thomas O'Brien, remembered a meeting where William threatened to fire anyone who complained about unsafe conditions. Standing at his father's side, Benjamin had watched every gesture, every tone of intimidation, and later he'd been seen practicing them, a 7-year-old boy mimicking power. But the most disturbing account came from Anna Kowalski, a floor supervisor who had worked closely with the child laborers. She reported that Benjamin began visiting the factory on his own that summer, not as an observer, but as something else entirely. He developed what she called an unhealthy interest in control. He started giving orders to older children, issuing threats, playing strange games of authority. The young workers obeyed, frightened that defying him might bring his father's wrath. Reading those testimonies, Harrison felt a quiet dread settle in his chest. Benjamin hadn't merely witnessed exploitation, he had learned from it. He had absorbed its logic, its cruel arithmetic. And when the portrait was taken later that same year, his eyes already carried that new knowledge. The detached precision of someone who understood how people could be used, measured, or broken. The Blackwoods, of course, had tried to contain what they could. Private correspondence in the family archives revealed that Eleanor Blackwood, Benjamin's mother, had grown increasingly disturbed by her son's behavior. In letters to her sister written during the summer of 1903, she described a child she no longer recognized, cold, deliberate, strangely fascinated by the suffering of others. She worried that the boy's time in the mills had been spiritually damaging, that he had seen things no child should ever see. She begged her husband to stop taking Benjamin to the factories, but William refused. He believed these early experiences were shaping his son into a capable heir, someone strong, someone strategic. Business demands a clear head, he had written in response. Sentiment weakens judgment. Still, Eleanor persisted. She even consulted a Boston physician, enclosing in her letters a chilling list of Benjamin's symptoms: a lack of empathy, an obsession with controlling playmates, and what she called an adult curiosity in causing distress. The doctor's reply, still preserved among the family papers, was both compassionate and precise. He urged that the boy be removed from the mills at once, perhaps sent away to a boarding school where moral guidance and companionship might correct what he delicately described as unnatural development. But William Blackwood dismissed the advice entirely. He considered Benjamin's behavior a mark of promise, not pathology. To him, the boy's cold intelligence was a gift, evidence that he possessed the instincts necessary to preserve the family's growing empire. And so, just weeks after these exchanges, the family commissioned a portrait. 4 figures immaculately dressed, arranged to project dignity and respectability, a perfect image for a family under scrutiny. Yet behind the polished surfaces and practiced stillness, the camera captured something else entirely. A child whose innocence had already been bartered away, and whose eyes had learned too soon how to calculate the cost of suffering. The portrait, when it was first displayed in the Blackwood home, was meant to tell a simple story of a prosperous family, secure in reputation and tradition. No one outside the household was meant to see what it truly contained. No one was supposed to notice the faint shadow in the boy's eyes, or the quiet tension in the way his hand curled against his side. The photograph was intended to reassure, to present the Blackwoods as ordinary. But to those who would later study it closely, it would reveal something far more unsettling. When Harrison traced Benjamin's life forward into adulthood, the documents painted a picture as grim as it was inevitable. The boy who had once stood silently among spinning machines and frightened workers had grown into exactly the kind of man his childhood had prepared him to become. By the 1920s, Benjamin Blackwood controlled the family's textile empire across Massachusetts and Connecticut. His expansion was swift, efficient, and merciless. Local newspapers spoke of his remarkable business acumen. But between the lines were other truths, hints of intimidation, relentless exploitation, and a growing reputation for cruelty that even his competitors found disturbing. Labor union records from the 1920s and 1930s told the story more plainly. Benjamin's mills were notorious, their name whispered in the language of strikes, protests, and grief. Workers described dangerous machinery, left unrepaired wages so low they barely sustained life, and children still toiling under false names long after laws had forbidden it. Union organizers recalled how Benjamin himself would appear during labor disputes not to negotiate, but to watch. He seemed to draw a kind of satisfaction from the tension, from the fear that passed through the crowd as he spoke, calm, precise, always, reminding them of what defiance might cost. Court records told an even darker tale. Families brought suits against his companies. Mothers and fathers who had lost children in factory accidents. Men crushed by failing looms. Women burned by unguarded vats of dye. The pattern was unmistakable. Negligence, cost-cutting silence. And again, Benjamin found ways to avoid consequence. He used the same methods his father had taught him: threats, influence, carefully placed payments, and the quiet manipulation of the law. Workers who sought justice were dismissed or blacklisted. Families who spoke too loudly found themselves evicted from company housing. He had learned early that power was its own protection, and he never forgot it. Personal testimonies from that era described him as a man untouched by empathy. He never married, never formed close friendships. He seemed to live entirely for the exercise of control, for the quiet thrill of bending others to his will. Several former workers remembered the same chilling habit. Benjamin would sometimes walk the factory floor without warning, watching the men and women at their machines as if observing an experiment. They could feel his gaze on them, cold and measuring, as if he was studying not their work but their fear. In all the archives, Harrison examined the articles, the letters, the lawsuits. One truth emerged with painful clarity. Benjamin's childhood lessons in cruelty had simply matured into an adult philosophy of power. He had become a man who could no longer see humanity in others. And so when Harrison looked again at the 1903 portrait, he saw more than a family, posing before a painted backdrop. He saw a moment, the exact moment when innocence had been replaced by something else. In the boy's fixed stare was the beginning of a lifetime devoted to domination. The echo of lessons learned in rooms filled with smoke noise and human suffering. The historian's final notes were careful but haunted. He wrote that the portrait captured not merely a child, but a symptom evidence of what happens when a society allows its most vulnerable to suffer unseen. It was a reflection not only of the exploited, but of the exploiters, those who, in protecting their own power, destroyed the empathy within their children. Benjamin's life stood as proof that cruelty once learned rarely remains contained. It seeps through generations, through systems, through time. In his report to the Berkshire County Historical Society, Harrison concluded quietly that the 1903 photograph was not just a family artifact, but a warning. A warning about what can happen when children are taught to see pain as profit, when they are not protected from the darkness of adult ambition, but invited into it. And as he sealed his notes that night, Harrison found himself lingering once more on that image, on the stillness of the boy's face, the depth of his gaze. It was the look of someone who had already learned the cruelest truth of all that power, once tasted in childhood, can become a kind of hunger that never ends.